Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today. I'm excited to be joined by a couple of experts we have today. Jim Barrall, a partner at Latham and Watkins, and Adam Kahle, a consultant at Hay Group. We'll be discussing realizable pay as we take an in-depth look at an alternative pay calculation and discuss all sorts of facets about this new and emerging useful tool in looking at pay. We're excited to have them. This is going to be really interesting. If you'd like to download the slide deck from our presentation, you can find that in our resource list. The focus of today's webinar will be specifically looking at realizable pay, and we'll look at it in three different facets. The first is we'll look at some calculation methods and some common ways that it is being calculated by some different entities. And we'll also take a look at realized pay, which is another emerging calculation. And through that, we'll be discussing the pros and cons of each of those calculations. What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses? Then we'll dive into looking at some of the realizable pay trends that come from Equilar's latest report on realizable pay, which came out earlier this week. We'll be looking at that and seeing what those trends tell us about realizable pay and about CEO pay in general, and try to glean some information from there. And then lastly, we'll dive into the application and disclosure section, where we'll look at how companies are using these different calculations in their proxies, how they're talking about them, how they're disclosing them, and we'll talk about what are the best ways, what are the best practices to disclose this sort of information, and what you need to know, what you need to be aware of when you're both discussing this topic and when you're thinking of disclosing it and talking about it in your CD&A or one of your other filings. So now let's look at why we're even discussing this topic. Why does realizable pay matter? What is the impetus for why we are talking about this? And I think there's really four big areas that we're going to go over today and that we're going to touch on that I think really have an impact of why we're doing this webinar now and why we're even talking about this topic at all. The first is pay for performance, obviously something that's always been important in executive compensation, but it really has been elevated over the last several years as with the market turmoil that happened in 2008 and 2009, then of course the implementation of Say on Pay, where shareholders now have a vote specifically on pay for performance and whether or not they think CEO's pay is an appropriate and really executive pay is at an appropriate level. Second reason is really proxy advisors. They're someone who now use realizable pay. That's something that's included in their analysis of pay, and when they're making their recommendations on votes, that realizable pay can certainly have an influence and can shade their how they determine what their recommendation will be and what they recommend investors should vote on. We'll talk about how they're looking at realizable pay and some of the differences there in just a second. Thirdly, institutional investors obviously are incredibly influential now with the vote on Say on Pay, and they're able to give their specific voice to what they think about it, not just including the proxy advisor's amount recommendation and looking at what they say, but also looking at realizable pay themselves. In fact, institutional investors are using Equilar's pay for performance tool to look at realizable pay themselves. And so understanding what and how they're looking at realizable pay and understanding what conclusions they're coming to, what information they have, will certainly help your company in trying to decide exactly where they stand, how institutional investors are looking at them, and what assumptions and information that they have available to it. So again, that's something that institutional investors are using Equilar's model, and so clearly we're able to see that they are taking this and using it in their determination about how to make their votes on Say on Pay for the thousands of different companies that they own shares in. And then lastly, the SEC. There's rumors that they're going to come out with some pay for performance related rules. We've been waiting on these for several years. but it sounds like they may come out with something in the next couple of months, and we'll get into that later in the webinar. But as that comes out, those very well may be shaded by realizable pay, and it'll be important to understand that information, what realizable pay is, what the marketplace is saying about realizable pay, and what that calculation might look like and what it might imply, I think are going to be important to be ahead of the game instead of waiting for the rules to come out and then trying to catch up on learning all of this stuff. So we'll talk about all four of these topics as we go throughout the webinar, but I think those four really have the biggest impact on why realizable pay matters and why we're having this discussion. We're going to look at three specific ways to calculate alternative pay different from what you'd see in the summary compensation table. The first two, the ISS model and the Glass-Lewis model, obviously important because the proxy advisors are using those. Those are actually models that can be replicated and used in Equilar's pay-for-performance tool and allows you to see what those values are and actually compare that to your peers and to the peers that those companies are using to compare you. So that's a really useful tool. And then, of course, we will look at realized pay as the third calculation. Now, that isn't the same as realizable pay, and we'll explain why that is and what the differences are. But it's a very prevalent calculation that a lot of companies are using. So want to make sure that we touch on that in today's webinar. So before we jump into everything, I want to just briefly share this quote from CalSTRS, which was found by Hay Group. Basically, CalSTRS is criticizing the use of Black-Scholes, saying you can't take it to the bank. And the implication there is that the use of the summary compensation table numbers, the grant date fair value of options specifically, but also with regards to restricted stock and performance awards, really don't provide a great picture of what is being realized and what value the CEOs and the executives are getting from their shares subsequent to the performance of the stock after the award is granted. So when it's granted, an option is valued at that date. If the stock price goes down or it goes up by a lot more than what was expected, that amount really isn't getting captured, and so it's not providing a great alignment with pay for performance. And so what the investors are looking for is that alignment between the performance of the shares and what effect that is having on the overall compensation level of the CEO and the executives. So as we look at some comparisons about the different calculations that we'll be diving into in a little more detail in just a minute, there's three big ones that we want to discuss in the webinar today. The first is the ISS realizable pay calculation, which specifically includes payouts and the intrinsic value of equity at the end of the measurement period. It also revalues options using the Black-Scholes at the end of the period. So it takes the intrinsic value and it takes the time period and then recalculates it at the end of the period, not just using the grant date value. Glass-Lewis does something very similar, but instead of revaluing options using Black-Scholes, what they do is they don't revalue options at all. And then, of course, there's the realized pay calculation, which is separate from realizable pay, but I think is worth discussing as it includes the value of options exercised and the stock awards vested during the period, and not necessarily what the value of outstanding equity awards are. And so that really focuses more on the payouts and what an individual walks away with as opposed to what awards were granted during the period. And so these are three alternative pay calculations different from what you'll typically find in the summary compensation table or looking at target pay. Now, Jim, what is the issue with target pay? Why is that maybe not as good of a measurement to use in determining pay for performance as opposed to some of these other ones?
Sure, Aaron, happy to address that. I think it's critically important for our audience to understand the context. And the context is that, as you said, investors, ISS and Glass-Lewis and others have for years been interested in trying to measure to what extent the CEO's pay and the other officer pay is aligned with the company's performance. And historically, they have done it by looking at the company's total shareholder return, stock appreciation, depreciation, plus dividends over a period of 1, 3 to 5 years, looking back in the rearview mirror. And that's what pay has been used for in the pay for performance analysis. You can use pay in all kinds of analytics, but in the pay for performance, it's been comparing it in the rearview mirror with what the shareholders got. And for this purpose, investors have been using largely the summary compensation table out of the proxy, which is full of good information, has a lot of data in it, is very important, but really is inadequate and inappropriate and even misleading to use in evaluating alignment of CEO pay with total shareholder return. And that's because the summary compensation table numbers are based on the values of the compensation at the date of grant, the projected values, with the equity values being typically determined early in the year when the grants are made, and with options and stock appreciation rights being valued on a Black-Scholes basis. And that's a snapshot on one day as the compensation is granted. That bears oftentimes no resemblance to what the CEO actually earns over time. And it's really unfair and misleading to look in the rearview mirror and said, well, the shareholders lost 50% of their value because the stock went down in half, and the CEO made tons of money because he or she was granted stock options 5 years ago with a Black-Scholes value of tons of money. It turns out that if the share prices went down, those options were worthless. And shareholders, investors, knowledgeable investors understand and appreciate all of that, and even the proxy advisors understand that. They've started to take that into account, and it's clear that summary comp table pay is not the way to look at it, and the question is, what are the alternatives? And that gets us into the discussion of realizable pay and realized pay, which companies are looking at and investors are looking at.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And so that leads us into, let's look specifically at some of these calculations and talk about sort of what their strengths and weaknesses are, why they're useful, what those calculations say about them. So about the pay of the CEO and its alignment with performance. So let's look here at the ISS model. And the thing to point out about this, what makes this a distinct model, is two portions. One is that they are calculating the value of options at the end of the period and then recalculating them using Black-Scholes. So including some assumptions about future performance and trying to get a more accurate picture of what the value of the option will ultimately be worth. It does capture the value of stock awards at the end of the period, and so whatever the stock price is at the close of the period, it will revalue those stock awards. The other aspect of the ISS model that provides a little bit of a distinction from some of the other models that we're going to talk about is it actually includes the change in pension and deferred compensation figure in it. And that's one that, as we'll see in the Glass-Lewis model, is not included, but certainly can have an effect as far as what the ending figure for pay ends up being. Now, as we look at the Glass-Lewis model, really the big difference between this one and the ISS model is the fact that for options, they do not revalue options using Black-Scholes. So whatever the exercise price is at the end of the period, compare that with the exercise price. So whatever the stock price is, compare that with the exercise price at the end of the period, and whatever the value of those options are worth, that's what is used as a value. And so that is how Glass-Lewis is specifically looking at it, and obviously that's the big change between Glass-Lewis and ISS is they're doing this. Now let me bring in Adam on this. Adam, what are these two models telling us? How are they useful, and what are the strengths of each of these as far as looking at a company's CEO pay?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Aaron. I mean, they're certainly very similar. The two main differences that I see is the ISS model includes the change in pension and deferred comp value, whereas the Glass-Lewis model does not. And then the ISS model is getting a little more scientific with options and that they're looking at the value of options granted and exercised, and then they're recalculating the Black-Scholes values for the awards that were granted but not exercised. So the ISS model is more of a way of all in trying to get the full picture of compensation, including a few more elements and a bit more specific. A lot of our clients have argued that change in pension or deferred comp value, it's difficult to say that is actually realized or realizable pay because of the fact that there are a lot of actuarial assumptions that go into that value, and it's not what the executive is actually receiving in that given year. So I think of anything within these models, that's received the biggest degree of pushback from our clients.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up as far as the actuarial assumptions affecting the realizable pay calculation. And in fact, I think this year we saw a number of examples, McKesson probably being the most notable one, of a change in assumptions, specifically the lowering of an interest rate affecting the amounts that were being seen in the table by pretty significant portions. For John Hamburger, and for those who haven't seen the articles, it was mentioned the calculation in their table includes about $21 million that McKesson associates with the changes in actuarial assumptions. Now, with Adam, you made an interesting comment about ISS having a more sophisticated calculation by revaluing options using Black-Scholes. And one of the slides in the previous section where CalSTRS was quoted that you guys provided that as a slide for this webinar, talked about you can't take Black-Scholes to the bank, and as something that is sort of an estimation in the future. Why would you want to revalue Black-Scholes, or why is revaluing Black-Scholes something that ISS is using to look at options instead of, well, let's just take what the number is because you can't guarantee what's going to happen in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, and I think what ISS is trying to convey is that those options that are not exercised still have value to the executive. And the best way for us to determine that value is to do a Black-Scholes in order to use the same methodology that we applied to at grant date fair value, just updating assumptions based on what's currently happening. And then when we look at what actual companies are doing and what we see our clients doing, the majority of our clients are not including, and the majority of what we've seen, companies are not including that Black-Scholes value of those that stock options that have not exercised, simply because it's complicated. Right. And the idea here is to present something that's simple for the investor to understand, and it just kind of introduces an additional level of complexity.
And Aaron, this is Jim. I'd like to weigh in on that. It seems to me that using Black-Scholes value revaluations for unexercised options not only is more complex and complicated, but it really doesn't make sense to do in the context of what is the pay actually worth at that time. The pay is what is the intrinsic value, the spread between the exercise price and the fair market value. It's not some other number at the end of the period. At the end of each period, that's what it's worth. And I frankly think ISS's use of that is simply backward looking to where we started from, and that's with the summary comp table that started with Black-Scholes value. I think that ultimately the trend will be that companies will take into account option values based on the spreads. That's what people can take home to the bank, as CalSTRS did say.
Yeah, you guys both bring up sort of interesting perspectives there. You have the investor side of things, and Adam, you made a great point of mentioning a lot of companies aren't doing this just because of the complexity. And so by revaluing options, what you're doing is you're adding an extra layer of complexity onto a process that is becoming increasingly more complex with the number of tables, the number of pay figures coming out, having a total pay number in the summary compensation table, but saying that's not the right number, and then having to calculate another number, and then saying that you're revaluing options, there's a current value, and then adding an additional value on some assumptions, just really makes things complicated. And as companies are trying to pass their say on pay, we've seen that simplicity and clarity of message has become a sort of a topic that companies have really beaten the drum for and said this is what we need to do and have found to be effective in order to communicate with their investors. On the other side, as I think companies are trying to figure out how to come up with the most accurate value of the options, that in fact, by not revaluing them, there might be some value that's left on the table that isn't captured, and so it makes the pay for an executive seem slightly lower than what they'll actually end up taking home. So it's one of those things where I think we're still looking at what exactly the marketplace will end up deciding as far as realizable pay. And let me jump to the next realized pay, and then we'll go back to that comment I just made about the marketplace trying to find a balance with realizable pay consensus. So now moving on to the last calculation we wanted to look at, which is realized pay. Wanted to make it clear this is in fact not a realizable pay calculation. This is a very popular alternative to target pay or to the summary compensation table, but it actually does provide sort of a different perspective in looking at pay that doesn't align with the whole realizable aspect of looking at how grants given during a certain period are affected by the performance over that same period. What realizable pay does is it takes out the grant date value or the awards granted during whichever performance period you're measuring, and it includes the value of options that are exercised during that period and stock awards that are vested. And so this obviously is a big change in terms of what are the potential values you might have, as it can include awards from outside of that period up to, think of 8 years ago if someone hasn't exercised an option and decides to do so, or it can include grants that were given during the period. And so it provides a little bit different calculation and a different story than you will typically get with a realizable pay, as realized, especially with the options, relies more on investment decisions by executives. And so that's a big change, but it is popular, and I think it's important for those who are looking at realizable pay to understand that realized pay is out there and that it's used quite a bit by a number of companies as an alternative pay calculation to show really what the executive has taken home with their equity as opposed to just what it is worth at the end of a certain performance period.
So,
Jim, you have something to say?
Yes. I mean, the problem with using realized pay for testing alignment in the rearview mirror of CEO pay against company performance TSR is that it really lumps up the pay based, particularly in the case of stock options, based on when they are exercised. It only takes into account compensation from exercised options. So those can be options granted in another period, as long as 10 years ago, exercised during the current period, the current 1, 3, 5-year period we're looking at, and they completely disregard any options granted which have not been exercised. And we know that in many, many cases, CEOs are not inclined to exercise their options until they're about to expire for all kinds of reasons. And so you get a very, very lumpy picture of the CEO's compensation relative to total shareholder return if you use realized pay for these purposes.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, that speaks to one of the criticisms of realized pay. As you can see here in the slide with the alternative pay comparison by Apache Corp, that actually goes on to speak about that ISS acknowledges that their pay is tied to the stock performance and shows a chart that demonstrates the realizable pay over the last 3 years and how there can be really a distinct difference between the realizable pay and then what is reported and the big effect that they can have. And that, again, is really the big reason why we are seeing these alternative pay calculations is the discrepancy between what executives are actually realizing off of the pay that they're receiving and what is being reported in the summary compensation table as has already been discussed. So as we've gone through it and discussed already, there's obviously a number of different ways to calculate pay that is not target pay, is not summary compensation table, and we talked about realizable pay. And I mentioned that the marketplace really hasn't come to any sort of a consensus yet. Obviously, the SEC, and we'll touch on this later, the SEC hasn't come out with any specific rules regarding disclosure or a formula, but there hasn't been any sort of standardized method with which to do this. Jim, can you talk a little bit about what's going on in the marketplace as far as trying to come to some sort of agreement or consensus on realizable pay?
Sure, happy to do that, Aaron. As you said, there's been a lot of cacophony, I would say, about how you define pay versus performance, pay for performance testing. That we saw in 2012, I think 115 proxy supplements with companies attacking the summary comp table usage by the proxy advisors. Clearly, that doesn't work, and the question is, what definitions can we come up with? In the wake of 2012, the Conference Board, the Society for Corporate Secretaries, the Governance Professionals, and the Center on Executive Compensation put together a working group that I happen to be on to try to deal with this, to try to come up with some standard analytics, conceptual framework, issues, and even proposed definitions and disclosure with respect to pay for the purpose of measuring alignment with company performance. And that group's been working since January of this year, working hard, making good progress. We've actually drafted a white paper that recently, as of Friday, I think, became available online. So if any of the listeners are interested, I would encourage them to go to the Conference Board website for the Governance Center of the Conference Board, and you'll find some materials there on alternative pay definition working group or something like that, where you can download a copy of our white paper that discusses the issues, the background, analyzes them, makes some suggestions, comes up with some sample definitions. We are seeking comments from issuers and investors so we can finalize these for the 2014 proxy season. So get your comments in by September 15. You can do that by actually logging on the website and putting your comments into that. And we hope, based on the prior discussions we've been having this year with groups of investors and companies, that this will be embraced. Clearly, there is no one way that works for every company. But I think there's some fundamental principles and approaches that make sense for trying to determine pay for performance alignment. And it's important to note that the pay can be higher than, not always lower than, the summary comp table pay, and that's just a consequence of doing what the investors and the shareholders want to see, and that is what is the alignment between what the shareholders made and what the CEO made. So it's fair to do it that way.
Thanks, Jim, for bringing that up. That's very, very interesting that we've got a group out there that's working to put it together with so many different organizations, and it's something actually that Equilar has been fortunate to be a part of, and we're expecting to be able to support the calculation and to be able to work with that group in terms of making sure that our clients and that people are able to use that calculation through our pay for performance tool. Adam, let me bring you in as far as the marketplace question is concerned. What are you seeing from your clients and who you're interacting with, and obviously from your perspective, as far as how they're using and looking at realizable pay, and for that matter, even maybe realized pay, and what's the preferred choice, and where do you think we're headed on that?
Mm-hmm. First of all, broadly, in terms of what we've seen in the market, Hay Group does a study every year with the Wall Street Journal on CEO compensation in the 300 largest publicly traded companies in the United States. And what we found is that from the 2010 study to the current 2012 study, we went from almost no companies reporting any realizable or realized pay disclosures up to 15% of those companies in 2012. And a lot of these companies are big-name companies such as GE, Alcoa, Hewlett-Packard, John Deere, Johnson & Johnson, Allstate, Tyco, and Starbucks Coffee, to name a few. And so we've seen this come into the marketplace. We've seen companies start to do this, even though there are no formal SEC rules yet. But companies are trying to anticipate what is coming up and are trying to draft these disclosures in a way that makes sense for their business. So ultimately, the decision whether or not to do this comes down to, does it make sense with our business strategy? Does it make sense with our the way we provide compensation to our executives? And does it make sense based on how we perform historically, how we are projecting to perform, and does it support our case? So these disclosures have become more and more complex. I think the most common that we've seen is kind of a simple realized pay calculation, and it especially helps a company that may not be performing all that well to show, although this proxy advisory firm is saying that our pay has increased over a given period of time, we can actually demonstrate that based on how the stock price has performed and based on the fact that a significant percentage of our executives' pay is provided in equity, that in actuality what that executive took home over this time period was less than the granting fair value.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, that's. I think that fits along with what we over here at Equilar are seeing as far as our studies have shown too. I think obviously realized pay is the simplest, which we've already talked about, and Jim mentioned some of the concerns and some of the issues with using that. But again, I think as we get further along into it and the sophistication of companies and the understanding of the subject becomes greater, I think we'll probably see more and more companies look to use a realizable pay figure as we move forward. So let's move on to the next section where we're looking at some of the trends from Equilar's most recent report on realizable pay. Pay. So let's look at what the results are of actually using realizable pay as a calculation and how that might differ from a target pay number that you'll typically see, and see if what the results are with regards to the trends in CEO pay, and see how that differs from what we've seen from other numbers, and really see if there's anything new that we can learn about CEO pay that we wouldn't necessarily get from the summary compensation table numbers. Let's jump into the numbers here, and we're going to do this really quickly, so I apologize if we go through the numbers a little too fast, but I want to make sure we get back in time to have enough time for discussion with Jim and Adam. But looking at this slide here of pay over each of the last 3 years using the realizable pay calculation, as I mentioned, the Glass-Lewis model versus the target pay number, you can see that realizable pay has much greater variation, as obviously in 2012 the equity grants have not had nearly as much time to grow and to mature as the awards in 2010, which explains why obviously the amount is lower. But you can see for target pay, it's a much more consistent number. It's not as affected by the market ups and downs. And again, because we've seen the stock market grow over the last 3 years, it's no surprise to see that the value in 2010 is up so high. And I think 2012, assuming that we continue to see that growth, will get bigger as we get further along in the performance period. Now, as we look at total pay, both realizable versus target in the 3-year period, looking at it on an aggregate, you can see actually that the median amounts are about the same, both around $25 million over the 3-year period. And so the story that realizable pay is telling us is very similar to what CEO pay is telling us as far as the absolute levels of CEO pay. Where the big difference comes in, and this is where the realizable pay calculation really sort of shows why it's important and what effect it has and how it's different from target pay, is if you look at the extreme, so for example the 90th percentile, you can see that the gap is much wider between the realizable pay number and the target pay number. And of course, this is really the design of realizable pay and why it's useful, because as individuals do really well and succeed beyond just their expectations, those awards will go up at a much greater pace and will be much higher than what you would get at target pay. Whereas if you were on the opposite end of things, where you're not hitting your targets, you're not getting any payouts, the amounts will be a lot lower at the bottom end of things. Diving into the equity, you can see that in target pay, options are actually taking up the largest portion between all three vehicles, time vested, restricted stock, and performance shares. But when you go over to realizable pay, you see that performance shares takes almost all that portion back and takes over 40% of the value that CEOs see. And you can really, that's caused because options are kind of an all or nothing proposition. If at target pay, they're using grant date value, so all options have some amount of worth, whereas when it comes to realizable pay, if the stock price goes down or is basically flat, there's no value for options. But for performance shares, again, if you go above and beyond what is expected, you're not just getting a higher stock price valuation, but you're also getting more shares and a bigger payout. And so that can really affect the levels of pay. And so you're seeing that reflected in these two graphs. Taking a quick look at industry, because it'd be remiss if we didn't break this down a little bit further so we can see how companies are doing by industry. You can see that one of the things that stands out is the financial industry actually has the biggest discrepancy, and I think this is likely due to just their structure of pay and the performance that the company has had. Those companies have had over the last 3 years. Certainly one of the more volatile industries that you'll typically see. And healthcare continues to be the highest pay. That's typically what you'll see in our CEO pay studies that are looking only at grant date values. But using the realizable pay calculation, you can see that amount, they're still up there as being the highest paid. What I think is also interesting is you can see that the services sector is sort of tied for first place with healthcare using the realizable pay calculation, whereas they're sort of number 3 or in the grant date pay calculation, 3 or 4 in the grant date pay calculation. So they have a nice variation there as well. And so they're many companies in that services sector, which includes retail and specifically media, have done quite well over the last 3 years and have seen the values in their equity awards grow. And I think that is one of the big causes for why their realizable pay amount is higher, about 1.7 million higher from a median perspective, higher than the services grant date target pay amounts. So let me bring in the experts here, and Adam, let me start with you and ask you a quick question about one of the aspects of pay that I think that I mentioned earlier has seen a lot of growth, which is performance shares and the impact that has had on CEO pay. What are you seeing as far as the impact that performance shares has had on the CEO pay package itself?
Well, thanks, Aaron. It's certainly becoming a larger portion of the equity portfolio that an executive receives. And in the study that I mentioned earlier with the Wall Street Journal, we found that performance shares are becoming more prevalent and are actually becoming more prevalent than stock options ever since it was mandated that stock options be expensed. There's a slow decline in stock options with a concurrent uptick in performance shares. So they're becoming a larger portion of the overall equity package, and they are also more volatile. Not only are performance shares measured via a particular metric, whether it be an absolute metric in terms of a financial metric or whether it be relative to a peer group. So what you often see in these plans is there's some degree of double leverage. You've got not only do you have that performance measure, but the shares are you receive an increase or decrease based on how the stock price performs at the same time. So it's interesting on the slide that you presented earlier of the pie chart of target pay versus realizable pay. What you showed in that chart is that in fact when we look at target versus realizable, that this performance equity is a bigger piece of the pie in the realizable pay, and that's really due to the fact of this performance shares having double leverage and a lot more variability than you would see with other types of awards.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about performance shares. Again, something that is being used more and more and is a bigger and bigger part of most CEOs' pay packages is creating that extra leverage, which is we saw as far as comparing the realizable pay versus target pay. Again, looking at the realizable pay figures at the extremes, especially at the high ends, those amounts are going to be a lot more, not only with performance shares paying out at a higher value and then the awards being increasing in value as the stock price goes up as well, but also just in terms of options. We saw that the value of options went down in realizable pay as part of the overall value was concerned. And again, a lot of that has to do with the fact that if you perform poorly and your stock price goes down, you're not going to see any value from an option, whereas you might see some value from time-vested restricted stock or even some performance shares if you're able to at least clear the threshold there. So that's a great point that you put there. To ask another quick question, and we'll jump on to what is probably the people's most pressing section of the webinar about the application and disclosure of realizable pay. Adam, let me bring you back and ask you about the figures are showing that CEOs have earned more than what was cited in the proxies. And how is it that CEOs, being a consultant, you're the one engaging the boards, you're the ones who has a personal relationship in terms of dealing with the people who are actually getting this money. How do CEOs look at their pay over the last 3 years? And, how do they envision the numbers? Are they looking at it more from a realizable pay perspective, or are they concerning themselves with their target pay?
Thanks, Aaron. It's interesting. You brought up a good point earlier that when you looked at the difference in target pay versus realizable pay, there's less of a difference at the median, at kind of the middle of the pack, but on the extreme ends, at the 25th percentile to the 90th percentile, there's a difference. So again, it's illustrating that when you take the company performance into account, there's a lot more variability. But overall, I think the fact that in aggregate you're seeing that CEOs actually have realizable pay that's higher than the target pay indicates that really in total these companies are outperforming what the grant date fair values would suggest. So they're ultimately realizing more value in those stock options than was predicted in the grant date fair value, in the Black-Scholes value of that option. They're ultimately getting above target on their performance shares, and they're getting a significant increase in their full value of awards and restricted stock. So it's really a function of performance, and the way CEOs look at it, it's both realized and realizable, and executives, not only look at this themselves, but they have wealth managers that are looking at their portfolio. So they're looking not only the value that they have in the company, but in their total portfolio, and are trying to both increase the return and mitigate risk. So they're looking holistically at this.
And Aaron, this is Jim. I think investors in general, unless they have political agendas, are happy with that situation. If in fact the CEO compensation is increasing because the company's outperforming TSR-wise and otherwise financially, that redounds to the benefit of investors. Investors are happy with that. The problem they have is when the CEO pay stays up and the performance stays down dramatically, goes down dramatically over some period of time, creating a disconnect between the pay and the performance.
Both excellent points. And again, I think a lot of this stems from the underlying theme here is basically you need to know what the pay is and to do so accurately. You can't have relying on numbers that maybe have a flawed perspective or maybe don't present the clearest picture is something that I think every company is going to need to discuss and to be able to do. So let's move on to the last part here and look at the application and disclosure of realizable pay and what that looks like in proxies and how, maybe from a practical standpoint, how companies should be discussing it and what they need to know about it, and why it's important in the first place and what you need to know about doing it. So let's jump into the section here and really look at how companies are looking at this information and what you need to know to disclose it well. So Adam, we've got a couple of your slides that the Hay Group put together, and you guys did a wonderful job of this and it has some interesting information. Adam, why don't you explain the next two slides and take us through those?
Certainly. Thanks, Aaron. In practice, there's no one way to do this, and there's no one right answer. And absent any rules from the SEC right now, companies are being influenced by a variety of groups. You've got shareholders, and you have the proxy advisory firms advising those shareholders. You've got the board and management. You have media. You've got compensation consultants that are providing input on how to do these sorts of calculations. And then lastly, we're waiting. We're waiting on what the SEC has to say on this. Next slide. So if you ultimately decide that you want to do a realized or realizable pay disclosure in your proxy statement, there are a variety of ways that you can do it. You've seen the examples up front for how ISS, Glass Lewis do it, as well as how you do a standard realized pay analysis. When you ultimately do it, you're going to want to look at a variety of inputs. You're going to want to model out various pay and performance scenarios. So based on what we've seen, these are some of the primary inputs that you might take a look at. First of all, are you going to use absolute or relative comparisons? And you can even do both. And are you going to measure yourself against your peers, or are you simply going to do a comparison for your company of pay versus performance over a given period of time? When it comes to the measurement period, you have flexibility in how you do that. ISS in their current CEO pay for performance comparison looks at 1 and 3 years and perhaps 5 years if they need to. So typically the types of measurement periods that we see are 1, 3, or 5 years, and they often align with a performance period if the company, for example, is using a performance-based long-term incentive plan. You might compare how the company performed over that period versus how the payouts were under that particular performance plan. You're going to want to put this in context. Beyond just pay, you want to include performance. And performance is often total shareholder return, but there are a variety of other metrics that you can use that are unique to your company, such as revenue growth, return on equity, any sort of metric that you view as really driving performance in the company. Lastly, we see a lot of companies provide not only this disclosure, but they'll have some sort of narrative comparing it to what's provided in the summary compensation tables. It's important to make it clear to the investor what the differences are between what you're providing in this realized or realizable analysis versus what you see in the summary compensation table. And lastly, the whole idea of realized and realizable pay, it's really flexible. You can include what sort of elements you want to in this analysis. You've seen examples up front for ISS and Glass Lewis, but really try to nail down the pay elements that you want to include. At a minimum, include total direct compensation in the consideration. Or a lot of companies focus just on the long-term incentives. But if you're going to look at the full picture, you include base salary, the short-term incentive portion, and the long-term incentive portion.
Thanks, Adam. Some really great points. Since we're running out of time here, and I don't want to keep our guests over too long, we'll skip over all the examples that I think we were going to do and just look at a couple. Specifically, let's look at Archer Daniels Midland, who does something. They do something that we're seeing a lot of companies do, which is in order to show pay for performance alignment, they're showing how their realizable pay compares with that of their stock price. So as you can see in the chart, they do a good job of indicating how the stock price has moved over the last several years, and then how pay has moved along with that. And again, that's really meant to demonstrate good pay for performance alignment. Another aspect that companies are using realizable pay or alternative pay disclosures to discuss and to demonstrate how their pay aligns with performance is comparing it to the target value amounts. And so what you see here with United Technologies is they're providing the difference between the realizable pay and then the target pay, the summary compensation table values actually, and how that varies. And so you can see for the summary compensation table numbers in this situation demonstrate pay that is a lot higher and is a much higher level than what the realizable pay amount is. So for example, in 2011, their amount is over $27 million in the summary compensation table, but using realizable pay, it only points to about $14.7 million. And so that sort of difference is something that a lot of companies want to point out as saying, hey, look, the numbers in the summary compensation table number may be very well overstating just how much the CEO is getting. And again, they want to make sure that as far as the discussion about how CEO pay is performing is concerned, they want to make sure that at least the numbers are right and showing that their pay may be getting overstated by the summary compensation table because performance hasn't been there. As you see in 2011, their TSR, that little dot in between the two bars, is at a lot lower level and actually below 0% as far as performance. And so seeing how that affects the overall pay level is important as companies wanted to demonstrate what their number is and how much overstated the summary compensation table or target pay number may make their figures. So as we're just about at the end here, I want to make sure we touch on some other things that we maybe didn't really get a chance to discuss that will be coming out, as there's rumors that the SEC will be coming out with some pay for performance and potentially CEO pay ratio proposed rules over in the next coming months or so. No one's exactly sure when, but I think there's the hope that it's coming soon. Jim, what are we seeing as far as the SEC is making progress on rules? What are we expecting to see, and what are your comments about that?
Well, as everybody that practices in this area knows, we've gotten some rules from the SEC under Dodd-Frank on pay, on a bunch of other things. We're still waiting for rules on CEO pay disparity, the CEO ratio to the median employee. That's a very hot political button that's getting a lot of attention in the Congress. We're waiting for rules on pay versus performance, which we've been talking somewhat about, and we're waiting for rules on hedging policies and clawbacks. Chairman White of the SEC, in testifying to the Senate Banking Committee on July 30, was pressed on when these rules are going to be coming out, especially the CEO pay disparity rules, and she said sometime within the next couple of months. And I think everybody's betting on proposed rules coming out in all four areas sometime this year, early this fall, I think, in order for them to be commented on and maybe take effect for the 2014 proxy season. So we've just had two commissioners take their seats on the commission, and I think the rules have been drafted. They need to be reviewed, and off we'll go. On the subject that we're most interested on for this program, the question of disclosure versus pay for performance. In 2010, Dodd-Frank said companies would have to disclose pay versus performance under rules to be adopted by the SEC. We've now waited many years. I think the world has changed dramatically since that statute was enacted. I think it'll be interesting to see what the SEC does, but I don't think it'll be determinative on what issuers and companies do with respect to pay for performance disclosure. And that's because the statute requires that the rules require disclosure on the relationship between executive comp actually paid and the financial performance of the company, taking into account any change in the value of the shares of the stock and dividends of the issuer and any other distributions, and that can be in a chart or so. So by its terms, the statute looks at compensation actually paid. And if you look at those words, and they're not defined in the statute, it sounds a little like realized pay. but we'll see what they say, number one. Number two, it's the company's absolute CEO pay versus its TSR and other financial performance. It's not on a relative basis, and I do think that even if we have rules that require disclosure about all of this, the proxy advisors, ISS, Glass Lewis, and the investors are still going to want to see pay for performance analytics in the rearview mirror on a relative basis. So I don't think we will escape doing what we've been talking about here, no matter what the SEC rules provide. I think they will simply provide another bunch of data that companies can use in telling their stories in very much the same way that the summary compensation table has done since 2007 or so.
Jim, that's a great point. And I know obviously there's a number of these rules companies have been waiting on for several years, waiting for them to come out. So it's good news that it's going to finally come out and people can hopefully stop waiting. I'm sure not the people who have to do the work around these rules are probably not very excited that they're coming out. An interesting point that you mentioned, that this is not going to do away with whether or not we need realizable pay disclosure, but rather it'll just be more data. Do you think that it's going to cause more companies to utilize a realizable pay discussion in their CD&A, or do you think that it'll be sort of moot and people will make that decision independently of the new rules?
Well, I think all the discussion of pay, the definitions of pay, all of that will encourage people to think about the relationship of pay to performance. And it'll be very interesting to see how flexible the rules are in terms of allowing companies to compare their pay against other types of financial performance, not just TSR, because there are financial objectives. So I think it's all healthy to contribute to the dialogue, but I do think to a great extent the dialogue between companies and investors on these issues has gone beyond the statute and probably beyond the rules.
Great. And Adam, let me bring you in here. And we're talking about they've got the SEC rules potentially coming out, and those are going to have some specifics as far as what a company is supposed to disclose with regards to pay. But as Jim mentioned, there's still obviously going to be a need to be able to tell your story beyond maybe what is mandated by the SEC if you feel like that is an important thing for your company to give a true picture of what how the company is doing and how the pay for performance alignment looks like. What should a company consider when they're thinking about disclosing realizable pay, and how should they be talking about it? What are some things that they may want to be wary of as far as if a company's looking to implement realizable pay in their disclosure for the upcoming proxy season?
Yeah. Put quite simply, this isn't something that you should do simply because it's a best practice. Often in compensation, we're kind of we have this mantra of you look at your peer group for best practices, and you should desire to emulate those best practices. But I think in this particular case, you should only do a realized or realizable disclosure if it makes sense for your company and if it supports the business case that you're trying to make. Where we've seen this work very well is where a company has incorporated this disclosure into the kind of the background of the business situation in the beginning of the CD&A, and really having that realized or realizable pay analysis support kind of the case that they're trying to build with regard to how the company performed.
So if a company's looking to do this, obviously if they feel like they're getting dinged by summary compensation table or by target pay, and so they feel like realizable pay is concerned, what happens if they disclose it one year and next year the numbers maybe don't look so good, so they want to switch to realized pay? Is that something that you think companies can get away with? Is that do you think investors are going to react to that well, or is that something that a company needs to consider going into disclosing realizable pay, or however they want to calculate an alternative pay situation?
That's a good point. I mean, really, once you decide on a method, ideally, to look good, you'd want to continue that methodology year to year. However, it may not always support your case, so you have to consider if we adopt this methodology, how are we going to look to our investors when we all of a sudden switch it up? Are we, is it going to seem, like we're trying to change the methodology to support our story? So, I mean, that's certainly something you consider because, obviously because there's no rules in place right now, you do have the flexibility of changing your methodology from year to year. And we have seen some companies that have not necessarily wholeheartedly changed the methodology, but have evolved it over time. And another interesting thing is you can either be proactive or reactive with this. And where we've seen companies be reactive is actually use this whole idea of realized pay to respond to something that ISS has said, where the example you showed earlier was for Piedmont Natural Gas, where ISS recommended an against vote on their say and pay proposal. Piedmont responded subsequently in an 8K, and basically, among, kind of picking apart at a variety of the ISS analyses, one thing they addressed was that, realized pay over that time period was actually less than the grant date fair value pay, and it's problematic to actually try to do a pay for performance comparison using grant date fair values instead of the actual realized values.
And Aaron, Jim here, I would add to that as Adam earlier said, the analysis of pay for performance and the connection, the alignment between the CO pay and the company's performance really is part and parcel. It has to be integrated with a discussion of the company's business plan, of its financial situation, of its business cycle, of what the directors in the company are trying to do, what managers are trying to do to move the company forward and create value, and that's where it needs to be told. And I think in general, companies need to do that on a principled basis and have to adopt a methodology of telling the story that makes sense for whatever cycle the company's in. I don't think you need to pick one way of doing this and you're locked into it forever, but you sure can't flip back and forth from year to year depending on whether the stock is in the money or out of the money. Shareholders and the advisory groups will see through that, and you'll be crucified. I think there has to be some consistency over time in how this thing is analyzed and presented.
That's great. And so it looks like we're just about out of time, but I want to make sure that you both are able to get in any extra points you want. Adam, why don't I start with you? Is there any final takeaway points or anything that any message that you want to convey to the listeners?
You caught me. Why don't we have Jim go first, and I'll think of an answer.
Okay.
Sure, Adam. The one thing I would ask of the listeners is that they, if they're interested in this subject, to pull down that white paper on the Conference Board Corporate Governance website, read it, think about it, and then lob in some comments, because our working group's going to be meeting for the rest of the fall, working on finalizing this thing and putting it out for the world to see, and we could certainly benefit from all the input.
All right, I've thought of something now. Do you want to just ask the question again, or?
I think Aaron thinks he did.
Sorry about that. We're having some technical audio difficulties there on our end. Thank you for your patience, attendees, and same to you, Jim and Adam. Adam, let me get to you with the final word here. Is there any last points that you want to get across to our listeners that you think is important for them to know that they're going to want to keep in mind after leaving this webinar?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I mean, certainly it's a time of uncertainty right now as we're waiting on rules to be released from the SEC. And, there's always been this mantra in the compensation and HR world of best practice. And companies want to look at what their competitors are doing, what their peers are doing, and they want to make sure that they're emulating best practices. What we've been advising our clients in this area is when it comes to this realizable pay disclosure, it may not be something that you want to do simply because other peers are doing it. You're going to want to evaluate if it makes sense within the context of how you've performed and concurrently how you've paid. And so we'd suggest that before you decide to make a disclosure, do an in-depth analysis of the various ways that you can compare pay for performance and do the realizable pay disclosure. See if it makes sense in the context of your business situation, of what you've outlined in terms of your compensation philosophy in the CD&A. Ultimately, if you decide that it doesn't make sense, at least you've done the work and you've got some background information on pay for performance that may assist you in the decision-making process with the compensation committee to evaluate executive pay.
Thanks, Adam. That's a great word for us to finish on. I'd appreciate if everyone would fill out the survey so we can get some good feedback on how we did on the webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for sitting in on today's webinar. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Jim Barrall and Adam Kahle, who provided really some great insights and some great points and education about our topic today. I know realizable pay is an important topic for everybody listening, and of course we're very interested in it here. For more information, visit the Resource Center for this webinar, where you can get obviously copies of the slides, which I mentioned earlier, as well as you can download the report, the Realizable Compensation Report, which has the information and the data that was included in today's webinar. You also have information on our Say on Pay data sheet, as well as a link to an article that CNBC referenced regarding realizable pay. Of course, if you have any questions or you would like more information about how Equilar can help you with your pay for performance needs, you want to learn more about our tool and its capabilities as far as being flexible and calculating pay in different ways, please feel free to either reach out to your account manager or to talk to one of our sales representatives. I'm sure they'd be happy to give you a demonstration of what we have and the tools that we offer and how they can really help you. Again, thank you everybody for sitting in today, and have a wonderful rest of the week.